Yes, Michael.
Welcome everybody. My name is Nimir Rawal. I am participating this event, important event as a co-president of United Nations Edmonton chapter. I'm a father. I consider myself as an ethnocultural person. I'm a brown person from India. I identify as a cisgender on Treaty 6 land. This is my home. We are here to discuss important agenda of racial equity, dignity, and rights of human beings on the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We recognize that injustice and prejudice fueled by racial discrimination take place every day. Observed annually on March 21st, it commemorates the day police of Sharpeville, South Africa opened fire and killed 69 people at peaceful demonstration against apartheid passed law in 1960. The United Nations General Assembly restates that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights and have potential to contribute constructively to the development and well-being of their societies. In its most recent resolution, the General Assembly also emphasized that any doctrine of racial superiority is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous and must be rejected, together with theories that attempt to determine the existence of separate human races. The United Nations places obligation on states and tasks them with eradicating discrimination in the public and private spheres. In Canada, this day, the date is opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that while progress has been made, Indigenous people, racialized communities, and religious minorities in Canada continue to face racism and discrimination every day. It is also a day to recommit our efforts to combat all forms of racial discrimination, injustice, systemic racism, and hate to ensure a world where everyone is respected, safe, and has equitable access to contribute meaningfully to all aspects of the society. Thank you. I will pass on to Guy to introduce himself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Namir. My name is Guy Blood, and I'm the current president of the Edmonton Interfaith Center. And it's a pleasure to present this examination of racism in cooperation with the Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation and the United Nations Association in Canada, Edmonton branch. Welcome. With expert panelists, we'll be looking at what we know and what we can do about it. We've all observed racism in our communities and have knowledge of its damaging effects. It's an ongoing issue that requires people of goodwill to be in a position, in a positive influence on those who may not realize the nature of the damage that they may cause by their unknowing behavior. And with that, I'll say welcome again and thank you for attending. I think we're passing to Burl. Burl, are you up?
Someone may have a parcel for me and say, Joshua Selman.
Hello? You're on mute. No, I'm not on mute. Hello, it's Beryl Scott. Guy, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Sorry, Beryl, just a second. I have to, I'm sorry. I need to get the list of people because I had to remove somebody. Sorry. Beryl.
There she is, front and center.
Go ahead, Beryl.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Beryl Scott, the president of Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation. And one of the day of March 21st that we normally represent is the day for elimination of racism. And the vision for us is that we do believe in this. But today I'm going to diverse a bit and go to the fact that look at what is happening in Ukraine today. And we are aware that there will be a need for CMEF to consider that we call upon to be upfront in living up to our goals, to be there for the Ukrainians who will probably be displaced from their country. And we need to be able to make sure that we are thankful to have them welcomed here in Canada, our country. And if they did and should come here, we'll be there for them. We cannot turn the blind eye to what is happening in the atrocities, but it's happening there. We're experiencing in their own country, and aware of that reason, this day is a very important day, not just because we're not sure is it racism or multiculturalism. So we need to be very careful of how we're looking at this and knowing that these people will require our help. So today I want to ask everyone to think of them and not turn our eyes to say, is it racism or is it multiculturalism, but that they're people who will need our help. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amarjeet Sohi, and I'm proud to be Edmonton's mayor. I would like to start off by acknowledging that the traditional land that I'm joining you from is Treaty 6 territory. I would like to thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries. It is a welcoming place for all peoples who come from around the world to share, which is something that I have personally experienced here in Edmonton. But this wasn't always the case. And that is why diversity, equity, and inclusion are so important. Like many racialized people, I faced racism and discrimination here in Canada. And I'm continued to be impacted by it during my time as an ETS driver, during my campaigns, and even now sometimes. You may not know this, but I'm the first racialized mayor in Edmonton's history. And this is also the first time we have ever had racialized women elected to our council. While this is an excellent step forward for our city, racism and hate-based violence still exist in Edmonton. And this is why we must all take action. We all want to live in a city where everyone is safe and respected, regardless of your race, religion, or culture. The work starts right here. It starts with you. I encourage each of you to commit to anti-racism and reconciliation now. Do your research. Learn about world history and the land you occupy. Diversify your social media platforms by following anti-racist educators. Share what you have learned with others. Reflect on your own biases and shift your perspective. Amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color.
Yeah, go in there.
Speak up when you witness injustice. Be courageous
You had left for a while?
and cultivate compassion
Oh,
always. Whether you're BIPOC or an ally, it is important that we stand together to denounce oppression and to create more equitable future for all of us. We are all human, and we are connected by the spirit of community. I believe in each and every one of you, and I'm certain that by committing to anti-racism, we can build a safer, more inclusive Edmonton for all of us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and look forward to meeting with you in person soon.
Everyone. So progressing to our agenda, we have wonderful 3 panels, and my job as a moderator is to first introduce them. So first I will introduce Salima Versi. She's a psychotherapist and a Canadian certified counselor with a master's degree in counseling psychology. She has her own practice, Rama Counseling and Consulting, specializing in providing cultural and spiritual support in mental health care. especially with Muslim women, women of color, and queer people of color through an intersectional feminist lens. She is PhD and instructor in U of A Religious Studies program, focusing on contemporary Islam and Ismailism within the Ismaili Muslim community. She is Alwaiza, a preacher, scholar, and pastoral caregiver. Added to this professional qualification is a commitment to social justice and community service. She has been a board member for several interfaith Muslim and feminist organizations and speaks on and participates in a variety of projects and discussion related to Islam, religion, feminism, social justice, and mental health. She is also the co-founder of Muslim Feminist Collective of Edmonton. Welcome, Salima. Our second guest is Stephen Camp. Uh, Stephen Camp was an Edmonton Police Service member for 30 years before retiring as a staff sergeant in 2020. He worked and led in areas such as hate crimes unit, homicide section, and alert internet child exploitation unit as an investigator, staff sergeant, and team commander. He researched and co-created EPS Hate Crime Unit and Chief Advisory Committee and ensured that operational sustainability and functionality meets the need of Edmonton citizens. He investigated hate crimes, hate propaganda offenses, and was involved in numerous long-term hate files involving specialized techniques, including an online strategy. The development of hate crimes unit, enhanced community engagement systems, and inception of Chief Advisory Committee resulted in EPS winning the International Association of Chiefs of Police Civil Rights Award. Stephen is a hate crime specialist and educator, trainer certified through U.S. Department of Homeland Security Hate Crimes Program. He is currently a hate crime content developer, educator, and trainer for police government, university, and civil society organizations, and has done so for 20 years. He has been a member of Alberta Hate Crimes Committee for 20 years and was a co-chair and president for 10. His passion led him to research and develop a report in 2021, advocating for amendment of Canadian Criminal Code to include standalone hate crime section. In January 2022, he entered master's program in justice studies with focus on hate crime. Welcome, Stephen. Our third dignitary on our panel is Satya Das is a Canadian writer, thinker, mentor, guru, and public intellectual. He serves as a strategic advisor and policy expert, focused most recently on climate resilience, sustainability, and emerging technology. Satya leads the Center of Excellence on Human-Centered Digital Economy at the Digital Economist, a think and do tank headquartered in Washington, D.C. Building on distinguished career in journalism in the last quarter of 20th century, Satya launched the advisory firm Cambridge Strategies Incorporation at the turn of the millennium. He has served on more than 50 major files of governments of Canada, Alberta, and municipalities, as well as public, private, and philanthropic boards. He believes deeply in community service as an engaged volunteer, but particularly in advocating social justice and human rights as a way of life. Satya is frequent commentator, thought leader, and public speaker in both of Canada's national language, in media, and in national and international events, most recently of COP26 Glasgow, and in virtual panel during World Economic Forum in Davos in January. His book includes dispatches from Borderless World, The Best Country, Why Canada Will Lead the Future to 2002, and Green Oil, Clean Energy for the 21st Century, 2009. His 2019 work of literary nonfiction, Us, offer a path out of politics of division and fear to a future that works for us all. Welcome, everybody.
And Namir, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but Charis is here. She is here. Our fourth speaker is here, and she's going to have to introduce herself. Thank you.
Namir, who you want to speak first?
I would like to give this mic to Charis because maybe it would be helpful to have introduction first and then go with the agenda.
So Tansei, and good afternoon, everyone. My government name is Charis Auger. My real name is Old Lady Bear that beautifies where she walks in the bush. And I am an educator and human being who is very privileged to be working alongside some of the most resilient young people that I've come across in my journey so far. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to speak today. I do not consider myself an expert whatsoever. And I, in fact, have a lot of uncomfortableness with people looking at me thinking that I know the answer or the Indigenous perspective. I'm just one human being on this earth walk. And so thank you for allowing me to introduce myself in a way that feels comfortable to me. So, hi.
Hi, thank you. So for every panelist, this might be the first question or generic theme that we want to ask. The first one is, what are common misconceptions? Who is doing what to whom? Motivations and why? How we address the problem? Is there something innate in humans that makes them want to feel superior to other? What changes do we want to see? I will just ask speakers to chime in. Okay, Salima, do you want to start?
Sure. Do you want my 10-minute response or a 2-minute response? Well, okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Salima. I'm coming to you from Amiswati, Wisconsin, which I assume most of you are as well, colonially known as Edmonton. I noticed we didn't do a full land acknowledgement when we began, so I'm going to do mine because I think it's relevant to what I'm going to say. So this place, Beaver Hills House, is a traditional meeting ground, a gathering place, a traveling route for a number of Indigenous communities that predate my time here, my family's time here, by many thousands of years. That includes the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, the Dene, the Nakota Sioux, and the Métis peoples. And I am bound to those communities by our common humanity and a trust that we know as Treaty 6. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years thinking about treaty, and particularly how to speak about treaty in a way that is in keeping with my faith and the places that I come from and the places that my ancestors come from. And the closest point of comparison I have is something that we call amanat. Amanat is a trust. It's a trust that is created between peoples and between humans and the divine, that is considered to be a moral obligation and a religious duty to uphold. And for me, that is what treaty is. Treaty is an amanat. It's a trust that we pledge to participate in the minute we choose to stay on this land. And it comes with moral obligations for all of us as people of faith, and for myself in particular as a Muslim, about what it means to share this land in a way that is generous and loving and compassionate and very much in keeping with the traditions of the Indigenous peoples who came into these kinds of agreements with good faith and good intention and have been repeatedly betrayed. And so when we ask questions about racism and about who's doing what and about how we approach those things, I think it's important that we start there, because more than anything on this land, that is our primary sin. It's that we live on this land in a way that is not in keeping with treaty. And that is something that all of us should be deeply concerned about. I am. So I wanted to start there because I think it's really important. And for me as a child of immigrants and as a Muslim, it occupies the heart of the work that I do. And I deeply believe that we cannot talk about racism and justice and freedom without talking about the ways in which we treat this land and the people to whom this land actually has been entrusted. And so I want to start there. Beyond that, the questions that were asked were about motivations and why we are in this place that we're in. And so I want to pull from some of my background in psychology, but also from faith-based perspectives to respond to that. When Netta first emailed to ask me about doing this session, she had asked this question of, you know, is this something inherent in human beings? Like, is there something in us that makes us push for superiority in these ways? And most psychologists and most perspectives in psychology will tell you that there is, that we are naturally inclined to stereotype and bias, that we will lean heavily on those mental shortcuts because that is just something that we do. And that's true. It's true that human brains are built in that way and that we will sometimes lean into those mental shortcuts and that can result in a lot of discrimination. And there are a couple caveats. So first is that we take those shortcuts more often when we feel that we are being threatened. When we feel unsafe, the brain will try and basically triage out anything that seems unnecessary or extraneous. And that often means that we lose a lot of nuance. Your brain is busy trying to survive, and it doesn't always make room for shades of gray in between, for complex understandings, for abstract ideas. And so one of the things that I want us to consider is, why is it that we're seeing so much of this right now? And could that have to do with the fact that we live in a world that is constantly making us feel unsafe? That we are bombarded by information and perspectives that are constantly telling us the world is significantly less safe than it has ever been, when in fact, most of us, particularly with the level of privilege that we have in this group, are largely and comparatively to our ancestors very safe. And so what is it about the world that we live in that's nudging us in these directions where we feel bombarded, where we feel unsafe, and so we're more likely to make these kind of knee-jerk snap reaction kind of decisions? So that's one. And the other one that I think is really critical to think about is that as much as, yes, stereotyping is built into the human brain, so is empathy and compassion. Empathy is an inbuilt human reflex. We see it in infants from the beginning, long before actually we see stereotyping build as a mental tool. We see kids do empathy in babies, right? We see mimic behaviors. We see babies cry when other babies are crying. Like, we see this like natural inbuilt human impulse to connect. And so the other thing that I want us to think about, in addition to this question of why do we feel so unsafe that we're inclined to do these kind of mental shortcuts, is which muscles are we choosing to flex? And I think that matters too. That yes, the human brain is built to do these mental shortcuts, and sometimes that means that we land in bias. And it's not the only way. It's just the way in which our society right now leans. And we can make other choices. Empathy requires of us more effort right now because we live in a society that doesn't actively foster it. We have to work at being empathetic because we live in a community and a society that doesn't make space for feelings, that doesn't make space for our own feelings, let alone other people's feelings, that we really, really struggle. And the best example I have for that is, if you ask an average adult to list feelings, they'll usually list 5 or 6, and then they'll stop. That's all we have. Those are the words we have. I like in my office, I have the inside out characters. Those are the feelings that we know. Those are the ones that like an average adult can tell you off the top of their head. But as humans, one of the great gifts that we have is this whole range of emotions that we don't actually know how to talk about because often we are lacking the language for it. And so we can't talk about using empathy as a tool when we don't even have the words to do empathy work, right? And so a lot of this is about what are we choosing to put our time and energy into in terms of the skills that we are learning and acquiring and practicing as human beings in this world. So I think those are really critical pieces. And I think they're things that often get missed in these conversations because we jump immediately into problem solving the world as it is. And that's necessary and critical work and work that I also do. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back and think about like, well, why do we keep hitting this wall? The other thing that I wanted to offer as a perspective that I use quite a lot in the work that I do around anti-racism is conversations around trauma. And I don't think we talk about that enough when it comes to racism. So remember how I said that we're more likely to do stereotyping and to do bias and to kind of take those mental shortcuts when we feel like we're unsafe, when our body, for whatever reason, is reading the world as threatening. Your body reacts like there's a bear in the room and your brain doesn't really care that there's no real bear because your body is reacting as though there is, right? And one of the things that we don't talk about enough is the fact that the body reacts in those ways often because of trauma. And so the conversations around trauma are conversations that need to be had if we're going to have conversations about racism. And that applies when we're looking at majority communities who feel like their position and power is being threatened by others who are coming in and choosing to take up space. And it is also important to have those conversations when we're talking about lateral violence. So my own personal work in anti-racism is within Muslim communities. That is, I primarily work on collecting my own. And working on why is it that we still have so much anti-Blackness in Muslim communities, or why is it that there are anti-Indigenous sentiments in Muslim communities? Like, what's that about? And often the answer is trauma. That we're coming from spaces of deep unsafety, that we have finally found slight respite, and that our bodies are still in a place where we can't make space because we're still feeling unsafe. And we need to address that head on. And it works in all sorts of ways. So we see that, as I said, anti-Blackness in Muslim communities, absolutely. But we also saw it in really complicated ways last summer when there was all of these like Islamophobic attacks on Muslim women in our communities, particularly Black, so racialized Black, visibly Muslim women in hijabs were being attacked on a regular basis, honestly. And one of the strange things that we saw was that some of those attacks were perpetuated by people who came from Indigenous communities. And that's a trauma thing. And we can't pretend like it's not. And when we miss that element, that's when we start to make stereotypes that are really dangerous. And so one of the really beautiful things that happened in the Muslim community last summer was that we actually had that version of the conversation, that we could say, like, you know, if there are overlaps between sort of Indigenous communities and how this is happening, then we need to have conversations about what's underlying that. And so I think that that's an important thing to consider too. So those are my three things that I just like to add to the conversation that I think sometimes get missed. And then hopefully we can keep chatting. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go to Stephen Camp if.
Sure, thank you. I'd just like to continue on with that. I think those comments by Salima were right on the money in regards to when she was alluding to the power structure that's been enabled in Canada from the birth of our nation and before then, the Eurocentric patriarchal kind of ideology that Canada was built upon. You know, according to the research, you know, our society was grounded on the principle of advancing kind of a racialized Eurocentric kind of society, grounded on exploitation and oppression, and then, you know, the preservation of racialized distribution of power and privilege. And that has continued on for the last couple hundred years in Canada. And, you know, I look at the issue as like what Salima said, it's a default to where it's convenient to quickly think that, racialized or Darwinistic theory, it was easy, I think, for them back in the day, where you have our immigration ministers at the time in the early 20th century talking about, the parties that they're representing and the people they represent as being standing for a white Canada, for example, or ministers in immigration talking about members of the Black community not suitable, or the Indigenous community not being suitable for assimilation. And then, policies such as the immigration policies that basically banned any race from coming into Canada, or even in 1919, for example, that discrimination was allowed and perceived to be legal at the time. Our prime ministers advocating for, grave problems, for example, that the United States were having with the Black community, and they didn't want that happening here in Canada. Indigenous colonization, residential schools, Indian hospitals, the Indian Act, all the same thing. If you look at the Jewish community, the Chinese community, the Japanese community, internment camps, exploitation of workers, all of this is tethered back in time. And then as time moves forward into the 20th century, and specifically between 1950 and 1970, what you have is the non-state actors starting to participate in this, because when the KKK was alive and well back in the 1920s, 1930s, we had 40,000 strong KKK members in Canada. They felt they were doing work for the government. As the 60s and 70s rolled forward, a lot of the far-right extremists began to believe that the government had failed them and the globalist elite had taken over. And so they start filling in that space of hate to control and continue propagating the issue of power in regards to keeping the racial hierarchy in place. And that's apparent, it's evident in the history, it's evident in the documentation in the archives, the things that were said right in Parliament to continue to perpetuate this racial myth. And I think if you look at far-right extremism, which kind of moves forward into hate crime and far-right violent extremism, that's what's happening here, a continual fear of loss of power of the racial hierarchy. And so I look at things that we need. What can we do pragmatically here for ourselves in Edmonton after 30 years in the police service, working for decades in the area of hate crime? Well, first of all, let's talk about what a hate crime is. I mean, a hate crime is a criminal offense against a person or property. So crime has to happen. I'll just quickly go over some of the things that I think is really important. One of the things that I do is educate and train on hate crime these days. And it's important for our police services, academia, government organizations, and civil society organizations to have a full understanding of what hate crime is, because hate crime is a unique type of crime in our society. It's not only the motivation that's important, but the specific type of harm it causes on the individuals, communities, and our society. It basically attacks the intrinsic, fundamental individual identity of a person, usually the permanent feature of a person. It's a message crime as well to the community. That a community member may not be directly targeted by hate crime, but they're feeling the same emotions: fear, anxiety, anger, wanting to retaliate, depression. It goes into things like, shame and changing their behaviors and not wearing the traditional clothing or religious clothing they want to wear in our society because of what's happening. So the whole community begins to feel what the perpetrators of hate want to send out, which is a message crime. And so that's an attack on our fundamental values and norms of our society in regards to freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of association, freedom of movement. And I find that hate crimes are a direct attack of not only our values, but the legislation that underpins those values, both at the national and at the international level. It causes society to be less open, less equal, less diverse, and less free. And I really believe that hate crime is something that needs to be kind of legislated as well. In our criminal code, for example, we only have a few sections dealing with hate. Most of them are the hate propaganda sections, 318 and 319. But there's one section for mischief to property utilized by an identified community for religious purposes or other purposes as well. But there's nothing else in there. I think it's important that we have a hate crime section. So, hate crimes, like I say, terrorize the community. They have really harmful effects on our individuals. They undermine the core legislation and the values that underpin that, the values for our society. It's the first time in Canada with the hate crime section of the criminal code, we would have a national definition of hate crime. And then subsequent to that, accurate and reliable hate crime data that we could tabulate. Right now, we depend on a number of NGOs and civil society organizations and academia to tabulate, and the police, but they all use different definitions. There's no standardization on this process. And, you know, hate crime data collection will identify social risks that we see. What is happening in Canada is hard to determine. We don't have accurate hate crime data to pull the research into. So that's a major issue. And I think the community would be much more trustful of a government and police if we actually show that we do care. We have a legislation in place that protects them under a hate crime section. You know, as Martin Luther King said, you know, a lot of people believe that you can't legislate. Morality can't be legislated, and that's true. But what Martin Luther King said, behavior can be regulated, and that's what the point of the legislation. He also said judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they sure can restrain the heartless from committing hate crimes on our communities here. And I think it's an important piece of legislation that we need to bring forward. And a lot of positive things are happening as well in Alberta, I've noticed over the last couple of years. And I know it's because of the uptick in hate crimes. So I'm trying to find some positives here. I mean, the last year in regards to hate crimes, a 37% increase in hate crimes, especially against the racialized communities, have been a horrible thing for Canada. But I did notice that in the work that I do, because I liaison with government, academia, and police, that there is a real appetite these days for more training and education for their frontline. Both, I'm talking not just frontline policing, but academia frontline, government frontline. For example, I'm working with the Edmonton Police Service on some online hate crime content development right now. We're almost done. McEwen University is building a hate crime modules for training for their students. The Alberta Association of Chiefs of Police, I just met with them a month and a half ago, and they're very interested in getting some training to the frontline officers. We have workshops that we're developing, putting out there as well. So that's all been really positive. So there's a general interest as well. I know there's a lot of conferences and workshops and seminars that are happening these days in regards to hate crime education. Our mayor and the council members, our city administration is working on the harassment bylaw to include the hate component in there as well. It looks like that's going to pass muster and be able to be utilized by our peace officers here in Edmonton. And, you know, the Alberta government as well, they developed a hate crime office, which is great. Staffed with analysts and subject matter experts to assist law enforcement in Alberta in regards to hate crime investigations, and the infrastructure money that's available. A lot of our religious organizations in Alberta were able to access monies from the Alberta government to make sure their places of religious worship are safer. Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say. Thanks.
Satya Das.
Thanks very much, Namir, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure once again to be with you from Amiskwachuskekan, the land of the Papas-Chase Cree Nation specifically, and Métis National Region 4. It's a particular pleasure to see so many old friends and new after the 2 years of COVID. And I'm sure that we've all noticed that the pandemic has had an effect on community mental health, as well as individual emotional health, which may in fact be expressing itself in greater degrees of prejudice, even leading to hate crimes. But the question that Namir posed to us is that who is doing what to whom? And I find this to be a really interesting perspective, because the first point of who is doing what to whom is the powerful to the powerless, as it has been throughout human history. Inequity is amplifying in every society. The wealth controlled by the 1% has now surpassed any bound of reason. And it's only natural that if somebody has 99 cookies and is instigating the rest of the world to fight over the single cookie that remains, that competition will then come down to tribalism, racialism, dominance, and essentially it is an expression of a culture of want, in which so much wealth and so much power is hoarded by so few. The very possibility of building a clement and inclusive society based on fairness and societal justice and inclusive societal development becomes more and more difficult. That said, the interesting trend in urban Canada particularly is that most of Canada's metro cities are minority majority cities. By that, we mean that there is no distinct or dominant ethnocultural group. There identifiably is, perhaps in Montreal, where you have people largely of Francophone heritage, of a certain European origin as the dominant, and perhaps in Vancouver, where you have a tripartite domination of Punjabi, Greater China, and British Isles culture. But apart from that, most of Canada's major cities, no one has a majority. And this is leading to some interesting conflations. For instance, I routinely come across immigrants here who have started their new businesses, who have derisive things to say about Canadians who are born here, about how lazy they are, about how they fake injuries, how they don't have work ethic, how they don't have drive. And I find that to be a form of unacknowledged racism as well. So in a sense, what I think we really need to focus on, and certainly in my 40 years as a public intellectual, I've seen the pendulum shift from identifiably race-based hatred to racial resentment that's exacerbated by economic inequity. We need to focus on interculturalism. As always has been, it is necessary to overcome otherness, as Salima pointed out, to have genuine empathy, to profoundly not just acknowledge, but feel and act on the injustice and the wrongs perpetrated against the first Canadians. That is still the underlying motivator and driver of racism all across this country. And it's shocking to me to see how quickly immigrant Canadians drink up the poison that's spewed against Indigenous inhabitants, the first residents of this country. I mean, Amiskatchewan has been inhabited for 10,000 years. The place we settlers call our home was stolen from the Papas Chase Cree. We really have to acknowledge the reality that we are perpetuating a crime by our very existence. And that should bring us a measure of humility as a starting point of overcoming otherness. Now, what do I mean about the intercultural sphere? What I'm really saying is it's not simply enough to put yourself in the shoes of the other. We have to learn about one another's origin stories, hear one another's voices. David Ridley from the Edmonton Heritage Council is with us today. Edmonton Heritage Council does a wonderful job of building intercultural connections, of helping us to share our stories of where we came from, who we are, what shaped us, what formed our sense of being and belonging, because it's only by that understanding and only by making those human connections that we can overcome otherness. I found myself incredibly moved by the courage and resolution that's being shown by Ukrainians right now. And then I remembered, when Ukrainians came here as settlers, the hardships they faced. And then again, but much of the Ukrainian settlement was on disputed land or on displaced land. So again and again, you see these cycles come forth. And as we continue, we simply have to get beyond the ideology of race, the ideology of fragmented identity, the ideology of tribalism and otherness, and recognize the simple humanity in one another. When we can see in the other an echo of ourselves and our own humanity, and here's my grandson, Krish, who's joining us today. Once we've seen each other, the echo of our own humanity, that's how we really begin to overcome racism. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the wisdom, everybody. The second question we would like to ask to the panelists is, any thoughts for moving ahead to combat racism, specifically in our day-to-day life, specifically in Edmonton, Canada? What hasn't been working? What has a better chance of turning the tide on hatred? What could we do better or differently? There's a lot of questions here, but if you want me to repeat, I can repeat again. Maybe I will ask Charis if she's ready to talk or have any thoughts around it.
Yes, thanks. So if I can just quickly touch on the first question that I didn't have the opportunity to speak on. I just want to, first of all, thank the panelists for the knowledge that they shared. I specifically want to shout out the first panelist who did a very heartfelt acknowledgement of not only the land, but the ancestors. And, you know, I've really been thinking a lot about the way that I was raised and the systems that I'm a product of, and one specifically being the colonial education system. I grew up in a small town in northern Alberta. I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I just knew that my parents, you know, and I'm very privileged that I had two parents, first of all. And I'm very privileged that they, you know, that my parents chose to raise me in a small town instead of their First Nation communities. And what I mean by that is my parents went through overt racism growing up. And if it wasn't for my parents making that hard decision to leave their First Nation communities to then live in a town where racial slurs were the norm, I don't think that I would be the human being that I am today doing the work that I'm doing. I don't think that I would have believed in myself enough to go into post-secondary or to even become a teacher, because I never had Indigenous teachers growing up. I didn't have access to culture or ceremony or my language. And I didn't even know that I didn't have access to it. It wasn't until I went to university and I paid a whole lot of money to take a degree in Native Studies. And I'm very grateful for, you know, the journey that I've been on, because I acknowledge that not many of my cousins will leave their community to come into the big city because of racism, because of oppression, because of these systems that have that we've all inherited. And so for me, when I think about my own journey, I wasn't taught empathy. I wasn't taught inclusion. I wasn't taught things that I am now coming to know are foundational within Cree Indigenous worldviews. And I'm still on this journey of reclaiming my identities and reclaiming my language and reclaiming that connection to Mother Earth, and remembering that, you know, I have a responsibility now, not only for those of us that are sitting in this space now, but the 7 generations before me and the 7 generations after me. And so when I keep those in the forefront in the work that I do, I am more able to create safer spaces where, you know, a lot of the young people that I'm now privileged to be alongside, that they can start having those conversations as well, and really making sense of all the things that are transpiring in our world. And so I personally don't believe that there's anything innate in us as human beings where we, you know, push others. I feel like those theories that a lot of us are exposed to in post-secondary predominantly are written by like cisgender white men anyways. So, I mean, that system of patriarchy isn't ours to begin with. That doesn't come from this part of Turtle Island. That is imported here. That's from somewhere else. And so I feel like the more spaces that are created where voices, diverse voices and experiences can come to be, where we can have these conversations and build community and really start to look at each other as relatives. You know, I feel like that's the way to move forward. And I feel like education is a big piece, because the reality is that we spend so many years in school And thinking about my own experiences, I finally got into a place where I'm not mad at my teachers that I grew up with, because I recognize that they probably came from the same school that I came from. And looking critically at the school that I came from, like the big ivory tower that I'm a graduate of, while we are making movements forward because of the TRC, because of Indigenous relatives who've worked really hard to create spaces, there's still a lot of work to be done. And all of us in this space are just on that journey together. And so I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me the space to speak. I really don't ever feel like I have anything to say, but this was my one piece. And given that I am a Cree person and we are storytellers, I just wanted to share some stories with all of you. And now these stories are yours, and you do with them what you will. Hi, hi.
All right, thank you. Stephen, do you want to talk about the question that I posed to the panelists?
Sure. The way forward for what I do and for where I come from, and I agree with Charis, education is paramount. Education to the community, education to civil society organizations, academia, government, and police are essential, not just to understand the nuances and complexities of hate crime, hate incidents, the impacts it has, and hate propaganda, but also to understand the history of hate and where it started, which was at the 17th century in Canada when the Europeans brought it over, and then the development of I keep calling it the caste structure, but a hierarchical racial structure in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century that proliferated hate throughout Canada. And then what happens then is the multitude of hate crime theories that develop by researchers since. I mean, there's why do hate crimes happen? You cannot have theories such as motivated by thrill or retaliatory or reactionary kind of thing without being all of it being tethered back to the history of Canada. There's no doubt about it. It all tethers back. And that's where it starts from. So education is paramount. I also believe in legislation as well. So I'm practical in my thought process as well. I really believe that Canada needs a standalone hate crime section. I think not only for the practical value of having a standard definition and data collection methods, but it is the proper thing to do for Canada, and that should be legislated. So yeah, legislation and education would be my answer, Namir, in regards to that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I saw Satya Das, he has posted something. Do you want to explain more, or do you want to,
No, that's fine. I just see
right?
that we're coming very close to the end, so I just want to share that message in case I didn't have a chance to speak. No, it's just the obvious fact that nobody is born to hate. Nobody is born to discriminate. Nobody is born to resent or to dominate. So we are actually born to love. The genetic hardwiring of every living organism is to collaborate and cooperate. I mean, I've seen this in nanomotors, nanotechnology at the cellular level. Not only is racism ideology rather than biology, biology itself calls on living beings to collaborate and to work in community. We have somehow forgotten that as humans, and it's a matter of reclaiming and reasserting the dominion of love. If our opening position to anyone we meet is one of love, as opposed to how are you different from me, that's how we begin to change ourselves, to have the shift within that Martin Luther King talked about. And really, if we have an open heart, an open mind, genuine empathy, and a genuine ability to ease the trauma and to address the pain of our fellow human beings, we will have a better and healthier community. And yes, Stephen, this can be legislated, this can be in curricula, this can be in stories, Charis, this can be in many, many different forms. But the dominant factor has to be a change within ourselves and within our own hearts to accept the humanity in others. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Salima, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple last thoughts. Mostly I agree, honestly. I think I believe deeply that our solutions come from community first and that they need to be rooted in love before everything else. And I also think that we're in a place as a society where we have forgotten how to do those things. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, how do you teach that? Like, how do you actually teach people to love one another? How do you teach people to build community? How do we get back to that cellular level thing that we know as humans about how we're connected? And so when I was writing my anti-racism course, spent a lot of time thinking about why we hit the walls that we do and how do we change that. And what I have found to be helpful is to teach tools before we teach content. So you actually have to teach people how to do empathy. You have to teach people what trauma is and how to work through it. You have to teach people about what does privilege look like in a world where we come from a scarcity mentality and how do we confront that. We have to teach people about intersectionality and how our privilege shifts over time and space. And then you can talk about anti-Blackness and residential schools and model minority politics and all of the ways in which we're getting in our own way as a community and as communities of people. But I do think it's really important we start thinking about how we teach this, because as much as I would love to think we can snap our fingers and suddenly go back to being those loving humans we should be, we are stuck right now in this pit, and we have to start thinking about how we pull ourselves and others out of it. And so, yes, educate, absolutely. And how we do that matters, right? Like, I worry a lot that when we do anti-racism work, we talk facts at people. And that's not how we learn as humans. We learn through story, we learn through feelings, we learn through connection. And so how do we build systems that allow us to do that work functionally? And so I want to ask us to do that first and foremost. And the second piece is that racism is not a standalone issue. This is not a silo. This is part of a larger conversation about justice. And so when we start teaching these things, we have to think about how we bring in that holistic perspective about who we are as humans in all of our diversities, and how do we make space for those things in an equal and equitable way, right? And so to push ourselves past this kind of siloed Western capitalist heteronormative kind of perspective into ways of being that are more holistic and that see those elements of the self as intertwined and interconnected. And for a lot of us that come from communities of color, that's who we are and that's where we come from. Those are our philosophies from the beginning. And so how do we get back to that kind of way of being, I think, is a really critical question. And the last thing, and then I'll stop, is just, because this is a gathering of people of faith, I want us to think really critically about how your faith encourages you to do this work, about the call to action that is inherent in all of our traditions, about how we engage with one another as humans in this world. And that if this is not work that we are doing every single day because we believe that it is what is required of us as people of faith, then that is a problem. And so I want to encourage everyone to think about, what are the actions? Like, love is a verb. Bell Hooks tells us love is a verb. It's a thing we do. How are we doing this in our lives every day and not just talking about it? So I'll leave you with that.
Hey, thank you. Any final comments, Charis? Do you want to say anything on additionally?
I am just blown away by this space that we've all created. And despite some of the disruptions earlier on, I'm super glad that my trauma brain didn't flight out of here, because my brain does funny things sometimes when I feel like I have to be on high alert, and I'm more of a runner. So I deuce out, I leave. So I'm super glad that I stayed. I've learned so much. It's definitely a lot of things that I need to think about for myself, and encouraging the young people that I'm alongside and really working towards our, collective traumas from Western education spaces and kind of how that can be rethought or, I just want to say thank you so much. I know I'm still in this active process of reclaiming my language, but one of our first laws as Cree people is actually love. And for that, it's called, or in our language, it's Sagituin. So hearing all of you speak today, it fills me with a lot of self-compassion and love. And it's a good reminder for me as I continue on this earth walk and the work that I'm doing and that all of us are doing collectively in the various spaces and places that we occupy. So I want to say hi, miigwech, and thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite Michael Frishkopf to introduce the soundscapes or to talk about it. Thank you all the panelists for your wisdom and sharing to all the participants here. It was valuable time. Michael, by saying thank you very much, I and all the participants and everybody who participated here got something that they can act on with the agenda of elimination of racial discrimination and social justice. And I really appreciate the three organizations, CMEF, Canadian Multicultural Education, Interfaith, Edmonton Interfaith Foundation, and United Nations Edmonton chapter to organize this event and also to make this happen for knowledge exchange and also to invite all the panelists here for their expertise and for the knowledge. So thank you, everybody.
So I wanted to talk today about Islamophobia, which is a terrible scourge in today's world. Sadly, including Canada, as you probably all know, just yesterday, worshippers at a mosque in Ontario were brutally attacked. And these kind of violent and hateful acts are perpetrated by the ignorant and the misguided who have somehow dehumanized Muslims. I don't doubt anybody's essential humanity, but there is a problem of understanding. And so in my view, we have to oppose Islamophobia by enhancing interfaith understanding, by rehumanizing the other through knowledge and wisdom, and not just facts about someone's culture or religion, but personal intersubjective knowledge that is ideally in friendship as the sort of the pinnacle of that, although it can't always happen. The humanization of the other is cognitive, but it's also social. And furthermore, it's also aesthetic and emotional. And this is where the arts come in, because it can take place, this process of developing an emotional, what I call resonance with another person, a kind of communal feeling or shared feeling, collective feeling, empathy can take place through the arts as human expression, as the most powerful condensed form of human expression. So those who fear Islam and Muslims must never have experienced the aesthetic dimensions at its very core, which are things that I experienced traveling to Saudi Arabia in December. As the Prophet Muhammad said, "Verily Allah is beautiful and he loves beauty." In its essence, Islam, both as worship and as community, is deeply intertwined with literature, with poetry, music, calligraphy, painting, gardens, and architecture. All of those are forces for spiritual development and paths for spiritual expression, but also ways in which the non-Muslim can begin to develop a more humanized sense of Islam and Muslims. Most central for Islam are the sacred sounds of recited texts and the spaces that are enhanced by natural and artistic visual beauty, the mosque, the garden. So if music is humanly organized sound, as ethnomusicologist John Blacking famously stated, then architecture is humanly organized space. Whereas textual comprehension requires linguistic fluency, the arts of pure sound and space transcend both cultural and linguistic boundaries to move everyone and to move them together. These transcultural aesthetic forms thus serve not only the Muslim, but the non-Muslim as well, and the cause of interfaith understanding, catalyzing these emotionally rich exchanges that produce empathy, personal knowledge, and maybe even ideally friendship. They are a point of confluence where people of all faiths find common ground in spiritual aesthetic experience for example, in a fragrant garden suffused with beautiful music. And we in Edmonton are the fortunate recipients of a gift, a multisensory garden of sight, sounds, and fragrances, the University of Alberta's magnificent Aga Khan Garden in Devon. And I wanted to start off just playing a quick video for those who maybe have never seen it. So I don't know how many of you have seen it, but hopefully it'll be opening again soon, maybe next month or so. What we did then, a group of us sought to enhance the garden with poetry and music. And so we conceived this project called Sounding the Garden, whose music you heard at the opening of this event. And then I just played it again along with that video. Here's a website that sort of summarizes it. The idea that I had was to actually map a very famous Sufi poem, Farid ad-Din Attar's Conference of the Birds, Multicultural in Arabic, literally language of the birds. It's an expression that comes from the Quran, which tells the story of a group of birds' miraculous spiritual quest through 7 metaphorical valleys of spiritual development. And this is something you often find in the Sufi traditions, which permeate all of Islam. It's not that Sufism is a sect, no, it's at the core. In search of their king, the so-called Simurgh, who turns out to be them. So it's a kind of a surprise at the end when they find out that what they've been seeking is all the while is themselves. So what we did is we mapped these valleys onto the Aga Khan Garden at the Botanic Garden, and then developed a phone app that would detect these invisible borders between valleys and play for you music and poetry and so on. This is the way we map the valleys. I hope you can see this. Is that visible? Hello?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay,
Mike.
good. So as you can see, there are 7 valleys. This is very common in the Sufi conception of the tariqa, the path. So the first one, when you enter the garden, is the Valley of the Quest, and then the Valley of Love, insight into mystery, detachment, unity, bewilderment, and then poverty and nothingness, as you approach sort of this state that the Sufis call fana, which is a kind of self-annihilation in God. And the beautiful thing about this sort of mystical approach to the religion is it's much less exclusive. It sort of addresses everybody, and you find very similar ideas in different spiritual traditions. So each valley is introduced by a text, including some poetry. But as I said, poetry isn't necessarily understood. The poetry is in Persian, and so we include also the translation and a little bit of overview of that valley. So as you would walk into one of the valleys, your phone would automatically start playing this. We can also do it not having, and by the way, here's a Persian miniature that also goes along with it nicely. We've embedded some of those too. So you go to this site and click here, and then on Reflect. And there's a number of different sort of augmented reality layers that have been developed for the garden. But we'll go down to, whoops, the wrong one. Reflect and Sounding the Garden. And then you can do it not at the garden. And just press play. So now here's the garden itself, and you can see the different valley. So if we click here, we can start the Valley of the Quest.
The Valley of the Quest.
چون فرو آیی به وادی طلب، پیشت آید هر زمانی صد تعب. ملک اینجا بایدت انداختن، ملک اینجا بایدت در باختن. در میان خونت باید آمدن و از همه بیرونت باید آمدن. سر طلب گردد ز مشتاقی خویش، جرعه ای میخواهد از ساقی خویش.
When you begin the valley of the quest, misfortunes will deprive you of all rest. Renounce the world, your power, and all you own, and in your heart's blood journey on alone. When love inspires his heart, he begs for wine, one drop to be vouchsafed him as a sign. When you begin the valley of the quest, misfortunes will deprive you of all rest. This is how Attar begins describing the first valley in the path. If you have a quest for finding yourself, your truth, your God, your ultimate reality, Attar suggests that you should drop your possessions and status and be willing to leave behind everything as you acknowledge that you don't know anything fully.
I know time is limited, so I just give you that taste of it. And whoever wants to see more or hear more can feel welcome. All the music we recorded, I and a number of students, some of them from Iran, some of them not, and it was all improvised pretty much. One interesting feature is that the Persian modes are called dastgah, are linked to the different valleys. So there's a number of levels of resonance between sound and poetry and spiritual development. But generally, I feel that this sort of approach can bridge differences because it addresses people at the level of the heart rather than requiring some kind of linguistic comprehension or cognitive sense of belief. It just sort of hits you directly. So that's all I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Michael. It was amazing to see how you have, how you have presented the music and, the spirituality and the sense, like how we can come together to cherish the common goal of who we are and how we can be on the same path as a human being, right? So thank you for sharing and showing as if like I was feeling that I'm in that garden and the music was playing. So it was wonderful to see that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so from my thoughts, there was a question regarding residential children, and I have posted a chat, a link to government website. There is an act called C92, which was, or a bill that was passed in January 2022, so recently. So they, what the act talks about is the indigenous bands or probably confederation of indigenous communities will have authority to process children's services cases and things like that. So there are things going in works right now. So just a kind of a heads up, and you can review the law or the bill that was passed. and government is also talking about it. Finally, I want to just have a closing and final remarks. Thank you everyone for being here and being supportive for this event. And thank you for being present. And I think it was a fantastic event, a wonderful event with a lot of wisdom on elimination of racial discrimination, what we need to do, how we can make the world better around us. And thank you for the 3 organizations, Charis Multicultural Education Foundation, Interfaith Foundation, and United Nations Edmonton Chapter. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Namir, standing in for as a moderator.